So how does a single anonymously published article end up defining 40 years of global foreign policy? Sounds kind of crazy, right? But that's exactly what we're talking about today. We're going to deconstruct one of the most influential essays ever written, a document that basically handed the West its strategic blueprint for the entire Cold War. All right, let's get into it.
Okay, so I want you to picture it. The year is 1947. World War II is finally over, but that grand alliance that won the war? Yeah, it's starting to crack. The US and its allies are looking over at their former partner, the Soviet Union, and they just see this huge, secretive power that's, well, it's expanding, and fast. So the question on literally everyone's mind was simple, but at the same time, just terrifyingly complex. What do these guys actually want? And then, an answer appeared. But it wasn't, some official government report or a big presidential speech. Nope, it was an article tucked away in the journal Foreign Affairs, and it was signed only with the letter X. Just X. This mysterious X article, as it came to be known, offered this incredibly deep psychological and political breakdown of the Soviet Union. And more than that, it laid out a roadmap that would go on to define the next 4 decades of world history.
So it turns out X was actually the American diplomat George Kennan, and what he proposed was, for the time, pretty radical. His first step was this: we have to crack the Soviet code. He argued that you can't just react to what the Soviets do. You have to understand why they do it. You have to get to the very source of their conduct.
And Kennan's core idea was this: Soviet behavior wasn't just random or chaotic. Not at all. He said it was the predictable result of 2 huge interacting forces. You had, on one hand, the official Marxist-Leninist ideology they were built on, and on the other hand, you had the brutal practical reality of what it took to grab and hold on to power in a country as chaotic as Russia was back then.
Right, so let's dig into those 2 driving forces, ideology and insecurity. We're going to pull these 2 threads apart and see exactly how they twisted together to shape the Kremlin's entire worldview. So Kennan basically split their motivation into 2 columns, what they said they believed and what they actually lived. In the ideology column, you've got this rigid worldview. Capitalism is evil. It's doomed to fail. The outside world is totally hostile. Simple enough. But then you look at the reality column and it's a different story. The Bolsheviks were this tiny, deeply insecure minority that grabbed power when the country was in absolute chaos. So for them, a brutal dictatorship wasn't just an option. It was seen as the only way to survive.
And to hammer this point home, Kennan brings in this amazing quote from the historian Edward Gibbon. See, his argument was that the Soviet leaders weren't just a bunch of cynical liars. No, they probably genuinely believed their own ideology, and that belief became the perfect justification for their ruthless, anything-goes quest for power. It's a classic case of how you can deceive yourself on the way to deceiving everyone else, a way for self-delusion to become a tool for total control.
And that deep-seated insecurity? Well, it spiraled into an absolute obsession with control. Inside the country, the Communist Party had to be the one and only center of power, period. Any potential rival, we're talking unions, other political groups, even just independent clubs, had to be completely crushed. And the justification for all this? Oh, it was easy. Just label any opposition as an agent of hostile foreign powers. Suddenly, the enemy isn't just outside the gates. The paranoia puts them everywhere, inside the country too.
Okay, so how does all that internal paranoia translate into a global strategy? This is where things get really interesting, because we see the Kremlin's deep-seated fear become its foreign policy.
The absolute core concept here is what Kennan called innate antagonism. It's this unshakable belief in Moscow that there could never ever be a true partnership between the socialist and capitalist worlds. The conflict was permanent. It was inevitable. Any peace treaty, any trade agreement, that was all just a temporary tactic, a move on the chessboard in a game that never, ever ends.
And when you start with that core belief, it's no surprise that you end up with the kind of diplomatic behavior that drove the West crazy. I mean, if you truly see every single interaction as a battle, what do you get? You get exactly this: constant secretiveness, deep suspicion, duplicity, the whole package. Kennan's point was that this wasn't just, Stalin being a difficult guy, it was the logical outcome of their entire worldview.
This brings us to a really brilliant metaphor Kennan uses to describe Soviet expansion. He says, don't think of it like some rigid army marching in a straight line. Think of it like a fluid stream. It's always moving, always pushing, constantly looking for any crack or any weakness. It seeps into every available space it can find. It doesn't have to follow a set path. It just has to keep moving forward, relentlessly.
And here's what made their strategy so different and so dangerous. The Soviets could afford to be incredibly patient. Think about it. Someone like Hitler felt like he was on a clock, that he had to act now. The Kremlin, they believed history itself was on their side. In their minds, capitalism was going to collapse eventually, so why rush? There was no need for these crazy all-or-nothing gambles. They could just apply steady, constant pressure, basically forever.
Okay, so just as Kennan finishes painting this picture of a patient, relentless, unstoppable force, he does a complete 180. He pivots to what is, for me, the most surprising part of his whole analysis, the idea that the Soviet system was actually rotting from the inside out, that it contained the seeds of its own decay.
And he made an incredibly bold prediction. He said that the Soviet Union, despite all its outward strength, was actually fundamentally brittle. He argued that if the West could just hold the line, just stop it from expanding for about 10 to 15 years, the system's own massive flaws would start to show. It would begin to tear itself apart from the inside.
And he wasn't just talking in hypotheticals. He pointed to very specific vulnerabilities. First, the population was physically and spiritually exhausted from decades of war and tyranny. The economy? It was a total mess. Fantastic at building tanks, sure, but absolutely terrible at things like growing food, building houses, or running a decent transport system. On top of that, there was a crying deficiency, as he put it, in basic quality and maintenance. And the biggest one of all, looming over everything, what happens when Stalin dies? There was no plan, no peaceful way to transfer power.
And he captures this idea with this haunting quote from the novelist Thomas Mann. He compares the Soviet Union to a distant star, one whose light shines most brightly right when it's viewed from Earth, even though in reality, the star itself has long since died out. The suggestion is powerful. Maybe the Kremlin's immense global power was just the afterglow of a system that was already hollowed out, already in a state of terminal decay.
So, after all that diagnosis, we finally get to the prescription. And it's a word that would come to define an entire era: containment.
So what exactly did Kennan mean by containment? Well, this is his definition, straight from the article. It's all about a long-term, patient, but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. The idea wasn't to start a war. The idea was to meet that fluid stream of Soviet pressure with adroit and vigilant application of counterforce wherever and whenever it popped up. You basically build a dam to stop the stream.
Now, this part is absolutely crucial because it's so often misunderstood. Kennan was very clear that containment was not about outward toughness for the sake of it. It wasn't about making loud threats or blustering on the world stage. It was meant to be a cool, collected, strategic policy. It required patience, vigilance, and intelligence, not just knee-jerk emotional reactions. As they say, it's a marathon, not a sprint.
So what was the ultimate goal here? What was the end game? Well, the point of containment was never to defeat the Soviet Union in some big, hot war. The goal was to frustrate its plans to expand. By doing that, you would increase enormously the strains on the Soviet system itself. If the machine couldn't grow outwards, Kennan believed, it would be forced to turn inwards and confront its own massive problems, which would eventually lead to either its breakup or the gradual mellowing of Soviet power. And he closes with this incredibly powerful and, I think, timeless thought. Kennan argued that the Soviet challenge wasn't just a test of military might or diplomatic skill. In essence, it was a test of America's overall worth as a nation among nations. The real question was, could the United States live up to its own ideals? Could it stay united, solve its own internal problems, and offer the kind of positive, moral leadership the world was looking for? The fate of the Cold War, he's suggesting, wasn't just going to be decided in Moscow, but right here, at home. And that's a question about national purpose that feels just as relevant today as it must have back in 1947.